In July 1996, Kelly Garrett got into a fight with her husband. The newlyweds argued back and forth, and Kelly decided to blow off some steam at a dive bar in Elephant Butte, New Mexico. She met up with her friend Jessie Ray, and the two spent the night at the Blue Waters Saloon. They're shooting pool, drinking beer, complaining about the men in her lives. You get it. But something didn't feel right. Kelly's beer was strong. It was stronger than she was used to. And that is because Jessie drugged her, and then somebody cracked her over the head when she stumbled into the parking lot. I'm Amy. Thanks for watching True Crime Recaps. Now, do you think people like David Parker Ray are born evil, or are they simply products of their rotten upbringing? Kelly awoke hours later to find herself chained in a dark, putrid-smelling home. She had a dog collar latched around her neck, and a short leash kept her from running away. She was naked and terrified, but it was about to get so much worse. Her captor entered the room. He was looming over her like a menacing shadow, and he wore a sadistic smile. His name was David Parker Ray, the toy box killer. But back then, Kelly only knew him as her friend Jessie's dad. For the next 48 hours, David and allegedly Jessie raped and tortured Kelly. She was kept on all sorts of drugs to blur her memory and keep her from fighting back. Meanwhile, a camera recorded the scene like some kind of sick snuff film. When he was finished with her, David dumped Kelly's body near her in-laws. Some accounts claim he slit her throat before dumping the body. Others claim he pushed her out of his RV and left her to die in the hot New Mexico sun. In either case, Kelly clung to life and she made her way back to her husband. But sadly, her story fell on deaf ears. He didn't believe a word coming out of her mouth. Instead, he accused her of cheating on him for the past 3 days. He filed for divorce, and Kelly moved to Colorado, where she stayed silent about her ordeal for the next 3 years. Meanwhile, David Parker Ray was free to stalk the New Mexico deserts, kidnapping, torturing, raping, and murdering innocent women, all in the name of sadistic sexual pleasure. David and his sister Peggy grew up with their grandfather, a disciplined man who ideally wanted the best for his grandchildren. But Old Man Ray was cut from an old school cloth. According to John Glatt, author of Cries in the Desert, the shocking true story of a sadistic torturer, he beat the kids when they misbehaved, and he worked them like dogs on the family ranch. David and Peggy's father only visited them twice, but those visits were enough to set David on a violent path. His father handed him sadomasochistic pornography, some really sick stuff. Stuff that sparked his fantasies about torturing and abusing women. He drew the images that popped into his head, but he was smart enough to hide them from his sister. But when Peggy eventually found the drawings and confronted him, he laughed and called it a new hobby. This was the early 1950s. A teenage boy isolated in the New Mexico desert drawing twisted images of rape and torture unfortunately wasn't raising any red flags. He went on to work as a mechanic in the Army, but was honorably discharged in the early 60s. He was twice married, twice divorced, and ready to move on to his third wife. He met and married an 18-year-old girl who gave David his only daughter, Jessie. According to John Glatt, Jessie, born Glenda Jean Ray, was a real daddy's girl. They were two sides of the same coin, and though his third marriage fizzled out, he stayed close to Jessie. It's hard to pinpoint when David started kidnapping, torturing, and killing innocent women. All we have is testimony from his surviving victims and accomplices. But perhaps the most gut-wrenching story is that of Cynthia Vigil, David's last victim and the woman who ultimately busted the toy box killer. It was March 1999, and Cynthia was a 22-year-old sex worker on the streets of Albuquerque, New Mexico. David pulled up beside her in his old RV and offered her cash for a date. When she went around back to climb in, he flashed a fake police badge and told her she was under arrest. She knew she'd fallen into a trap, but it was too late. He yelled, "Cindy!" And before she wrap her head around the fact that he seemed to know her real name, a woman appeared from behind a curtain and tased her with a cattle prod. Oh, this was no arrest. It was a kidnapping. They duct taped her mouth and clamped a steel collar around her neck. Unable to move, Cynthia was trapped in the back of the RV while David and his accomplice Cindy Hendy drove 4 hours back to the toy box. Cindy was originally from Washington State, but she found her way to New Mexico in 1997. When she met David, it was like instant sparks. They quickly bonded over their shared sexual fetishes, and it wasn't long before she was living in Elephant Butte with him, despite the fact that he had bragged about all the women he'd been killing for decades. Well, he sure lucked out when he found Cindy. She wasn't repelled by his stories. She was into it. Fast forward 2 years to the moment when Cynthia Vigil woke up in a 15 by 25 foot semi-trailer. David had spent upwards of $100,000 to turn it into his private pleasure pad from hell. There were no windows, the only door was steel, and it was locked from the outside with heavy deadbolts. It was designed to be escape-proof and soundproof. It sat behind his trailer. She could scream, and he wanted her to, but there wouldn't be any help coming. She was chained to a bed with a dog collar around her neck, and the first voice she heard was David's, but he was nowhere in sight. Because see, he didn't just want to physically torture his victims, he liked to mess with their minds too. Now, years earlier, he had recorded himself describing in detail what would happen next for his latest victim. Like some sick serial killer training tape, Cynthia learned how life would be as David and Cindy's sex slave, a life that involved sex with animals, brutal torture devices, electric shock therapy, and mind control drugs. She wasn't the first woman to die in the toy box, and as far as David was concerned, she wasn't going to be the last. Then they proceeded to rape, torture, and humiliate her, ignoring all her muffled moans and pleas for mercy. They hung her from the ceiling, they whipped her, they threatened her with guns, they poked and prodded at her with an ice pick, while David had his way with her whenever he pleased. But he promised things could and would get worse, and it was no idle threat. The space was decorated with diagrams of female anatomy, instructions for how to cause the most pain, and signs reminding him and his accomplices not to trust a captive slave. This place was her inevitable grave. She had to get out of there. David liked to keep his victims alive as long as possible, and Cynthia was on her 3rd day in his company. But our sadists still had normal lives to lead. On March 22, 1999, David headed to work as a maintenance man at the Elephant Butte National Park. Cindy was left in charge of the prisoner. When she took a phone call, Cynthia saw her chance to escape. A set of keys sat on a table one desperate reach away. She grabbed the keys and undid the locks that bound her. She picked up a nearby phone and dialed 911, but Cindy caught her and cut her off. She threw a lamp at Cynthia's head, knocking her to the ground and spilling a box of items on the floor. Among them was the ice pick the couple used to torture her. Now, Cynthia grabs the ice pick and she's like slashing at Cindy's throat. And when her captor stepped back, Cynthia made a run for the door. She crashed through it and she runs naked through the desert. Her chains are like dragging on the ground. And 2 motorists drove past her as she cried out for help because of how absolutely horrifying she looked. She's naked with blood pouring down her face from the gash on her head. Chains are hanging off her arms and legs, and there's still a metal collar padlocked around her neck. In the distance, she spots a well-kept mobile home. The door was open and she ran inside, slamming it behind her. She caught the homeowner off guard, as you might expect, but she begs the woman for help, and the woman tells her husband to go and grab a rope to cover this poor naked girl so she can call 911. And while they waited for the police to arrive, poor Cynthia is hiding under a table and the couple standing watch at the door in case the girl's captors tracked her to their trailer. Now, when the cops arrived, Cynthia broke down as the stunned officers did their best to convince her it was finally over. She told them as much as she could and directed them back to David's trailer, but the police were already there. Her first 911 call from there was long enough for dispatch to send an officer to investigate. The crashing lamp and the sudden disconnect prompted the operator to call back. And when Cindy answered and insisted the call was a mistake, it was like, nothing to see here. Well, they didn't believe her. There was something about it that made them believe that someone needed help. And they couldn't have been more right. Cynthia's descriptions about the hell that she'd been through were unlike anything they imagined, but the bruises and electrical burns all over her body backed up her story. But by then, her kidnappers were in police custody, and they are over there insisting that she was a heroin addict who they were just trying to help detox. Now, the only way to confirm anything was to search the trailer and the toy box behind it. First, police found the broken lamp. That confirmed Cynthia's story, and then they recovered the bloody ice pick. Next, they found her clothes and the fake police badge David used to kidnap her. One officer, who will never sleep again, assumably, he even found a detailed set of instructions for Cindy to follow while David was away. And finally, they found the audio tape that Cynthia had described and pressed play. What they heard was even more gruesome than Cynthia recalled. It started like this. Hello there, B-word. Are you comfortable right now? I doubt it. Wrists and ankles chained, gagged, probably blindfolded. You're disoriented and scared, too, I would imagine. Perfectly normal under the circumstances. For a little while, at least, you need to get your shush together and listen to this tape. It is very relevant to your situation. I'm going to tell you in detail why you have been kidnapped, what's going to happen to you, and how long you'll be here. Psycho talk. It ended with these words. Be smart and be a survivor. Don't ever scream. Don't talk without permission. Be very quiet. Be docile and obedient. And by all means, show proper respect. Have a nice day. The middle was filled with nightmare-inducing details about the sick things that he and the lady, that's what he called his accomplice on the tape, the lady, were going to do to her. Quick side note. The tape was first recorded in 1993, 4 years before he met Cindy Hendy, so I'll just leave that right there for you to think about. Now, by the time Cynthia escaped from him in 1999, he'd accumulated thousands of pieces of evidence that would later be used against him. The 15 by 25 foot space was covered wall to wall in sexual torture devices, mirrors on the ceiling, made sure that their victims could see what was being done to them in excruciating detail. Police found David's hand-drawn pictures of what he planned on doing to his victims and a vast collection of surgical tools to inflict pain and torment. They recovered an assortment of medical equipment, whips, and homemade electrical devices. They found syringes and all sorts of restraints. But the piece that he was most proud of was the dentist chair that he had turned into a gynecological torture device. It was like a sex shop for the criminally insane, but among the most revealing pieces of evidence was a detailed page of directions about handling and manipulating a sex slave. Psychological torture was the name of the game. Now, David told his victims precisely what he would do, like a doctor explaining a surgical procedure to a patient. The instructions also emphasized keeping the victim off balance and her mind and body in a constant state of stress. His Sex Slave 101 manual concluded with 16 brainwashing techniques, including fear tactics, isolation, abuse, and the rare favor. Before leaving the toy box, police found a home video starring a young female victim with a distinctive tattoo. With enough evidence to arrest David and Cindy 20 times over, police charged them with Cynthia's kidnap and abuse and set their bail at $1 million each. But news spreads fast, even in the desert, and the media storm that followed turned up more victims. Angelica Montano saw Cynthia's story in the paper and came forward, claiming that she had suffered the same fate. Angelica had stopped by David and Cindy's place to pick up some cake mix because the three were friendly acquaintances, so imagine her surprise when David pulled a knife on her. And when she looked at Cindy for help, she saw a gun pointing back at her. They raped and tortured her for 4 days before driving into the desert and dropping her off along the highway, after first threatening to murder her if she told anyone what they did. A police officer drove by shortly after and picked her up off the road, and so she told him everything that had happened, but nobody ever followed up. Defeated and scared, Angelica kept her story to herself, and over time, the drugs that he gave her turned her memories into nightmares. But when she saw David and Cindy on the news, she knew she had to say something. As for their other victims, the most solid piece of evidence they had was that home video. But who was the tattooed girl on the tape? The story about the horrific sex dungeon in New Mexico spread across the country, eventually reaching Kelly Garrett's former mother-in-law. She phoned in and told police how Kelly went missing for 3 days, only to return looking like she'd been through a war. They chalked it up to drugs and another man at the time, but that didn't feel true anymore. Well, Kelly was living in Colorado by now, but New Mexico police got a hold of her and confirmed she was the girl in the video. The prosecution thought they had a bulletproof case with 3 star witnesses, Cynthia, Angelica, and Kelly. However, the judge decided to split their cases into 3 separate trials. Cindy agrees to testify against David for a lighter sentence, and she had a shocking revelation to share. She wasn't David's only accomplice. She claimed that not only did his 31-year-old daughter Jessie join in, but there was another man involved too, 27-year-old Dennis Roy Yancey, and she'd heard that the 3 of them killed a woman. So Dennis told police that in July 1997, he, David, and Jessie pulled up to the Blue Waters Saloon, one of their favorite hunting grounds, and he claimed he was told they were there for a drug deal. But the father-daughter duo went inside and returned with Marie Parker. Now, Dennis and Marie used to date, and Marie and Jessie were friends, which makes what happened next all the more horrifying. They drove Marie back to the toy box, where they tortured her for 3 days. Once finished, David told Dennis to strangle her to death and dump the body. He claimed he did it out of fear for his own life, but even though he tried to point out where he left her body, she was never found. And Marie wasn't the only friend of Jessie's to mysteriously go missing. 22-year-old Jill Troya was last seen with Jessie Ray in an Albuquerque restaurant in 1995. Now, Jill was originally from Michigan, but she crossed paths with Jessie while she was in New Mexico serving in the Air Force. Complicated. The 2 of them dated, and then she went missing. She's never been found, and her case has long since turned cold. Although, according to reports, Albuquerque police firmly believe that David and his daughter had something to do with it. According to Cindy, David's favorite place to dump bodies was the Elephant Butte Reservoir, but when authorities searched the water, they never recovered any remains that could be directly linked to his crimes. But that's not to say that they never found a body. In 1989, Billy Bowers was found floating in Elephant Butte Reservoir. He was last seen a year earlier in Phoenix, Arizona, at the auto repair shop where he worked as a mechanic. And, wait for it, as it turned out, David used to work there too, before he found his way to New Mexico. When Billy's body worked its way back to the surface, he had a bullet in his head, and his stomach had been sliced open and weighted down. Well, this was a trick that David had told Cindy about, a way to make the body sink for good, or so he thought. And it was a practice that he used repeatedly, according to her. Cynthia's case was scheduled for March 2000, but for some reason the judge wouldn't allow any of David's early interviews with the FBI or the state police into evidence. He also blocked expert FBI witnesses and postponed the trial after David suffered a convenient heart attack. Then, out of nowhere, in May 2000, the judge changed his mind and Kelly went first. Now, straight out of the gate, the prosecution ran into a brick wall of justice. The judge didn't allow David's Sex Slave 101 manual or any tools that were found in the 1999 raid into evidence, suggesting that, hey, maybe they weren't there in 1996. Then, just days after the trial started, the final roadblock came. Angelica died of pneumonia at just 28 years old. She'd become heavily addicted to drugs and she couldn't cope with her terrifying experience. Can you blame her? The prosecution suffered a serious setback without her testimony. When Kelly took the stand, she recounted her experience and even had to watch the home video in court. but David's lawyers insisted it was all consensual. They poked hole after hole in her story, and her foggy, drug-induced memory didn't convince the jury that she'd really been held against her will. Weeks later, the judge declared a mistrial after 2 jurors decided David was innocent. One of them told the New York Daily News they weren't positive he was actually torturing Kelly in the video. He said there's a lot of people who enjoy rough sex, and I gotta ask, maybe this juror was one of them, because this was not just rough sex. The prosecution wasn't about to back down, and they decided to try him again for Kelly's case, but the judge threw a final monkey wrench into the whole thing when he died a few days into the second trial. So his death and the disqualification of 2 other judges delayed the retrial to like a full year after Cynthia's horrifying escape from the toy box. But thankfully, this does have a happy ending. The jury convicted him on all charges the second time around, but David maintained his innocence. He said he felt raped and he only did what they wanted him to do. Creating those tapes was pure entertainment for him. After all, the recording started with a disclaimer saying for adult entertainment only. But before Cynthia's trial could start, he ditched his innocent rhetoric and took a plea deal. So what could make a man like that back down? His daughter. Jesse was looking at serious time for her role as one of his accomplices, so he offered to plead guilty if she got off with a lighter sentence. In the end, David got 224 years in prison, while Jesse only got 2.5, plus 5 years of probation. And in the end, David never really did any time either. In May 2002, he suffered another heart attack and died. Cindy became eligible for parole in 2017, but she served 2 more years before her release in 2019. Now, those 2 years counted as her mandated parole, and she walked out of the prison a free woman. As of 2022, she was living in western Montana. Now, meanwhile, Dennis was paroled in 2011, but a violation landed him back in prison until 2021, and we can't say for sure what happened from there. As for Glenda Jean Ray, Jessie, she'd be 55 years old as of 2022. She's still out there somewhere, but has remained off the grid since her release from prison. But was it punishment enough to live her life as the toy box killer's daughter? Or is she biding her time, waiting to open back up for business?